case I haven't introduced myself already, I'm Fiona Godley, Editor-in-Chief of the BMJ. I hope we've got two speakers today, but at the moment I have only one with me, Bill Summerskill. Is Ed Sykes in the room? No. In which case, I'm sure we can discuss press. Oh, we've got Richard Price here can discuss. Other press officers in the room might be called into action. This is really a session to talk about, I suppose, dissemination of research, and some of the discussion may well focus on what is evidence and what the journal's plural role is in terms of creating or disseminating evidence as opposed to research, if those two things are different. So I'm going to first of all introduce Bill Summerskill, who's an executive editor at The Lancet based in London. He has a specific interest in creating collaborations with researchers in Asia and has been exploring evidence-based approaches to research, care and policy in Asia, but is based in London and obviously can speak therefore for The Lancet. Bill, over to you.
Thank you, Fiona. Good afternoon. If you read Carl Hennigan's blog, and you most certainly should, you might wonder whether there's actually a tension between journals and those people who practice evidence. And are we actually singing from the same sheet? Well, I think the fact that this meeting is co-sponsored by the BMJ shows that these interests are very closely related, but they're not totally related. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the practices of one journal regarding evidence. And I hope that this would be useful to you, both in terms of submitting articles, so you may have a clearer idea of what might favor a submission, and also in terms of interpreting research and trying to decide whether this is something that can help you with your own practice. So my aims this afternoon is to distinguish between research and evidence, to describe what research interests The Lancet, to discuss the process of publication and the factors that influence a manuscript's success, to share efforts that we're trying to apply at The Lancet to improve the quality of published papers, so that by the end of this session, you'll learn that although journals respect evidence, we may be more interested in research for its novelty and its ability to change practice. I hope you'll understand the types of manuscripts that appeal to journals and the reasons for that. And you'll appreciate that publications represent a continuum between research and evidence. And finally, that you'll find this useful in your own work. Well, how is evidence defined? I think this is one reason why editors may get a little bit anxious at the word evidence. Because this was published under the heading of evidence. It's a paper by Hwang from Korea, and we all know what happened to that. It certainly was not evidence. So what do we mean by evidence? And actually, it's not important what we mean. But what does the general public mean? So going to Wikipedia, evidence is defined as the research is defined as the search for knowledge. And evidence being everything that's used to determine or demonstrate the truth of an assertion. And of course, what we aspire to, evidence-based practice, being the application of the best available evidence to clinical decision-making. I wonder if another way of looking at this, and you have to forgive me here for being a farmer, is actually to look upon research as being the roots. Evidence as the tree that springs from those roots, and evidence-based practice as the fruit that that tree bears. And with this image, you see that roots are essential, but a lot of them are out of sight and underground, and they may not be direct sources of evidence for you. And indeed, we heard this morning from Carl that when Thomas Wackley started The Lancet, he wanted to dismiss obfuscation. But he started out in the first instance not to publish evidence, but to publish information. He saw that there was a keen lack of information for health professionals that would enable them to improve their care. And so back in 1823, The Lancet was founded as a source of information. And from the outset, content was important. And Thomas Wackley said, I want to inform, I want to reform, and I want to entertain. And in the evidence world, we can certainly embrace the desire to inform and to reform. But entertain stands outside that. And we're not talking of entertainment in a light-hearted way, but that it should be a pleasure to pick up The Lancet each week, and there should be something there of interest and delight for anyone to read as they flick through the pages. And I think one of the challenges of evidence-based practice is very often the better the evidence, the drier the text in which it is presented. And so today, looking at our information for authors, it's the same principles that guide our content. It's looking at contributions that are going to advance or illuminate medical science or practice, or that educates or entertains. But moreover, the central message to our would-be submissions is that we're going to prioritize original research that is likely to change clinical practice or thinking about a disease. And as evidence matures, precision is added, but there may actually not be a fundamental change in thinking, and that's an important distinction. And medical editors, much like yourselves, have entered medicine with a desire to improve health. And for us, the journal is the organ by which we try to achieve that. It can be done indirectly, with research that changes thinking, directly, with compelling practice-changing research, and we can actually augment these situations with opinion pieces. So, for example, in the newspapers this morning, there was a fair amount of coverage about David Nutt's latest report looking at alcohol as the most dangerous drug in the UK. So last year, we actually published a series of 3 papers looking at alcohol and health. In the same issue, we had original research by Richard Peters' group looking at alcohol and mortality in Russia. Now, I'm not going to persuade you that a retrospective case control study is a high level of evidence, but there is a synergy at work here. So against a background of papers to stimulate thinking, a paper then showing very specific examples of harm in the setting of Russia, followed by an editorial which drew this together and pointed out the implications of current policy and its shortcomings in Russia. Now, time series cannot associate causality, but it was interesting that a few weeks later, Medvedev had actually embarked upon an alcohol reform policy in Russia. So when we talk about research that's going to change thinking, practice, policy, this is the type of thing which The Lancet is interested in. So what do we look for? It's research that's going to change thinking. of interest to a wide audience because we're a general medical journal. And perhaps unique from other journals, we're particularly interested in first and last publication. So what do I mean by that? If you imagine an arch, we are interested in the foundation stone. That first piece of research, even if it's a phase 1 study, which we encourage, that first piece of research that lays the foundation for a new way of thinking and practice. And then we're interested in that last piece of research. Not that there ever is a last in research, but that piece here, the keystone, which draws together this way of thinking or practicing, unifies those ideas and provides a foundation for the next stage of research above it. Now, if you're doing a systematic review, you will know very well that actually that first piece of research is unlikely to be of as good quality as the subsequent incremental advances, which will be fashioned to a far higher standard. And that in a systematic review, it is the totality of all of these pieces of research that help to give the conclusion. So they're all important, but at the Lancet, the ones that we want are the first and the last. We also place ethics as highly as evidence, so that there may be a paper with very compelling findings, and if we are not satisfied, regardless of what ethics committees approve that research, if we're not satisfied that this is ethical research, we feel it has no home in the Lancet, and it will go elsewhere. Like you, we believe in the robustness of methods and the right methods to answer the question being asked. And we do our best to make sure that by the time it comes to the reader, it's been reported fully. So where does that place us in the hierarchy of evidence? You can put n equals 1 at the top for those of you who insist. There are journals that concentrate on systematic reviews. There are journals that concentrate on case reports, and everything in between is represented. Now at the Lancet we do publish case reports, and unlike some other general medical journals, we do publish systematic reviews. Our feedback from readers is that randomized controlled trials provide one of the most useful sources of research to inform practice for clinicians because of the clarity by which clinicians can interpret generalizability and outcomes. So about half of our content are randomized controlled trials. And this is similar to New England Journal, JAMA a little bit less. Now, as soon as one starts talking about randomized controlled trials, the evidence high ground gets enshrouded in a mist, because people associate RCTs with a good level of evidence, but they're also associated with other factors. One of them is citations. So are journals attracted to RCTs because of citations? And to that I would point out that if one wants to drive citations, it's reviews that are a far more powerful engine to raise citations than articles. And we know that celebrity papers, those that are immediately highly cited, this wonderful study by John Ioannidis shows that actually their fame tends to be short-lived, and it isn't long before larger, better done studies often show that their effect sizes have been exaggerated, if not just plain wrong. So there is always that slight wariness about the highly cited celebrity paper. Well, maybe journals go after randomized controlled trials for reprints. But the total number of randomized controlled trials between 2003 and 2009 in NHM, JAMA and ourselves actually has gone down. So there's been no mass increase in the publication of RCTs as one might expect. Furthermore, I've been going through our RCTs and only about half of them would be pharma-sponsored. So I think RCTs deserve their place on the basis of evidence. And let's say you've done a good RCT, you submit it to a journal, and you're unsuccessful. So why do bad things happen to good papers? Well, there is a chance that that RCT, regardless of its flawless design, may not change practice. And this is very much the argument of Ian Chalmers, that we need to be quite clear in defining a research question, that this is research that needs to be done, for which an answer is needed and there is true equipoise, and then that it is done in the right population to answer that question. Papers that haven't been done in the right population or in the right way and cannot change thinking are going to be less popular to general journals. The other problem, of course, is the first and last phenomena, and an excellent RCT may actually be a confirmatory trial with an incremental advance in understanding. And hence, it may actually be better placed in a more specialized journal. And there are also external events. After the FDA makes a decision not to license a drug, the interest in papers examining the effectiveness of that drug are going to drop off precipitously unless they add to the understanding of adverse events or the complications which have caused the withdrawal of that drug. And there are always external events that influence what types of research come into vogue. And one external event is luck. And sometimes it can just be bad luck that one paper gets submitted one week and accepted, another paper the next week gets rejected. And it's an important thing to bear in mind when you're trying to interpret research and ask yourself, why did the journal publish this research? Well, J.P. Getty had this wonderful quote, that no one's opinions are better than their information. Therefore, if at The Lancet we're in the business of providing you with information, we need to provide you with the best information so that you can have the best opinions and so that you can create and interpret the best evidence. So how do we do that? Well, much of it we can take no credit for. Things like the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors have really led much of the activity to improve presentation through the registration of randomized controlled trials, the encouragement of reporting standards, the transparency of conflict of interest statements, and so forth. And this is something that you can expect from many journals. A few things that we've tried to do is feeling perhaps as frustrated as you to see a paper where the well-asked question has not been designed adequately for an answer. So about 15 years ago, we introduced a protocol review service. And if you're undertaking a randomized controlled trial, we invite submission of the protocol, which if we think it's a good question, answered properly, we will send out to peer reviewers. We'll get it peer reviewed just like a paper, send it back to the authors for revision, and if it's accepted, a summary is posted on our website, and we will guarantee peer review of that paper if it's submitted to The Lancet and it follows the protocol. So the reason for this is trying to avoid the publication bias against studies in which no difference is shown. Because actually, if the question is good enough and it's answered well enough, then that answer is going to be of interest to our readers. Over the last year, we've introduced 3 layers of internal review. First of all, a screening by a deputy editor, an individual editor read of the strongest papers, and then a group editorial meeting discussion before a paper even goes out to peer review. This is mainly because authors have told us if they're not going to be successful, they want to know as early on in the process as possible. So it's trying to put in more effort at the beginning of the process so that papers go out are really the strongest ones we have. And there are a number of checklists we put these papers through. One of them for a randomized controlled trial is a checklist. And I suspect you'll be horrified to know the first question on that checklist is, does the trial registration number on the paper match the trial registration number on the database? So that's the first thing we check. And then we will go through the protocol step by step to make sure that there is fidelity. The reporting guidelines, which have been made so much more accessible through the Equator project. Then, of course, peer review. And now plagiarism software before final acceptance. And acceptance isn't the end of quality assurance. The whole point of having a post-publication process that involves correspondence to extend the scientific debate about the research, corrections if necessary, and every couple of years, if we run into problems, maybe even an expression of concern. The context of the research is also important. Beginning this year, we have offered authors a link to their full protocol, so that in the methods section, we encourage authors, whether it's an observational study or a randomized controlled trial or a systematic review, to post the full protocol on their institutional website, and we will publish a link to that, so that readers of papers can get additional information from the protocol if they wish. We've introduced a research in context panel this summer, and in addition to the usual research in context interpretation that many journals do, we've actually asked for a systematic review showing how the authors can reassure us that this research is novel and fills a gap. Context is also provided by a comment, sometimes by an additional editorial, by web appendices, a press release, and with about 1 in 3 papers, we will have an interview with the author as a podcast. All of these efforts to provide a greater context to enhance the understanding of the manuscript. But we always want to move towards better evidence. And I hope this afternoon in the panel discussion, we will revisit ways to do that. The purpose of today's meeting and tomorrow is to improve evidence-based decision-making. I would hope that you would agree that journals have a role in improving that by providing the highest quality research that we can to inform your decisions. Develop ideas for using evidence in practice. The whole point of us publishing research is so that it actually can be placed into practice to benefit populations and individuals. So we're always looking for ways to bring that step closer to the publication process. So I look forward to hearing ideas from you about that. To foster effective innovation, and here I believe there is room for partnerships between clinicians and journals, between investigators and journals, to help define the research agenda so that it addresses real needs of real patients rather than needs that may be perceived or defined by other interested parties. So to conclude, I think we have a shared effort here. We're all working at that interface between the science of medicine and the practice of medicine, and I hope that with better understanding by journals of the needs of people to apply evidence, and by better understanding of those who interpret research of how it is published, we can actually help make the interpretation of practice and science of medicine a truly unified process. Thank you.
Bill, thank you very much indeed. Can I just ask, is Ed Sykes with us? No, in which case we'll have to improvise. I'm sure we can do that. I've got lots of questions for Bill, but I wonder the best thing would be to ask you, Bill, to come and sit up here. I'm tempted to... I can see Ben Goldacre in the audience. I'm sure Ben will want to contribute. Are there any other press officers in the room? I mean, not that Ben is a press officer. Any press... Oh, Richard, you're there. Anyone else who's not in research or clinical medicine, but in dissemination outside in some way? What's your role, sir? Sorry.
I was editor of the journal Stroke.
Oh, right. But have you been involved in the kind of journalistic side of it? I think I'm trying to balance...
Well, I'm the president of the Royal Federation of Neurology, and I'm very interested in this.
Marvellous. Well, that's fantastic. Anyone involved in journalism here? Hello, sir. What is your role?
I'm editor of Journal of Pakistan Psychiatric Society.
Say it again. Editor of...
Editor of Journal of Pakistan Psychiatric Society.
Oh, a journal?
Yes.
Very good. Okay. I'm thinking more on the kind of newspaper journalism, because that was the aim of having the kind of balance between the academic and the non-academic. Ben, are you up and willing to take a role in here at all, or would you rather not? You weren't even listening, were you, Ben? Well, I might call on you later, but anyway. Bill, do you want to come and step up here? And I mean, maybe if I leave those in the audience who want to contribute in other ways can shout out. And so, questions for Bill, and then I've got some of my own to add in.
I have a couple.
Have we got a microphone? Can you hear? Oh, there's a microphone there.
Two questions, if I may. The first one, is there any relationship between the preference of some journals for novelty and articles that may change behavior and the high mortality of celebrity articles? That's the first question. And the second question is, I think that we are very fond of information, but there's little evidence that unless you link it to motivation and implementation, most information is fairly useless. It does not change practice.
I think you might need to speak into that.
So there were two questions, as I understand.
Is that working? Yes, carry on.
The first question about novelty, and the second question you were talking about articles that change behavior.
Yes, no, I'm asking, one of the things we appealed for, and I think it's a very good idea, sort of saying, can the practitioners help us set the research agenda? Because there's little evidence that providing information, however high quality, changes practice, unless you link it to some motivation, some incentive, some monitoring. And so my question is, we're very happy to talk about information, but I think as far as I can read the evidence, unless you link it to some sort of feedback, whether it's positive or negative, it does not change practice. And so I'm asking you to elaborate on your appeal to make it more practical, information more practical.
Okay. Just as we know that implementing change in a clinical setting requires a number of interventions to reinforce the message and get it across, we do the same thing, and I'm sure Fiona does with the BMJ, in publishing a paper, trying to tease out the important points and put those into context. So that would be done on an academic level through a commentary. And the comment ideally will point out exactly how the information from this research can be used to change thinking, change research, change practice. At another level is the communication to the wider lay media through a press officer, which tries to make sure that the central message is preserved and translated in a true form, showing just what its implications are, but also its weaknesses, with a balanced press release, trying to make sure that absolute numbers are included whenever possible. And then parallel to that, activity on the web, such as the podcast, where you might interview the author. And so you get the same message again, but conveyed in a more colloquial and relaxed sense with different nuances. Now, will that end up changing practice? We would like to think that each week you will look at Newsweek and you will find out, like that slide, what changes you have affected the week before. But I think the truth is, it is probably more like having a chronic patient in your consulting room, and that you may repeat the same messages, you may try different ways of communicating, and you may never actually be sure when the actual seed of change has been sown and when it blossoms. I think for this reason, it's important that one does have that arch of research, because the cornerstone that we publish in The Lancet is then going to be capped by other pieces of research that are going to reinforce that research, that are going to add precision to the estimates that it provides, until one day it is all encapsulated in a systematic review. So I think it's a slow process, and I think there are those who would argue that maybe it's not right that just one paper by itself should result in a change of practice. It's not often you have those killer papers that do that, but it's contributing to a continuum of effort.
Thank you very much, Bill. More questions? Have you got the microphone? Oh, yes. Pass the microphone. Yes, just, should we take 3 questions at a time? There's one there, and was there another hand I saw? Oh, here. So we've got 3 here. There's a lady there. Yeah. And then the 2 there. Yeah.
Okay. Lubna Al-Ansari from Saudi Arabia. Thank you very much for nice presentation. My question is about plagiarism software. Is it really a released or available software, or is it a kind of qualitative assessment of the chances of having a problem with this paper? And has the validity or the accuracy of this software being assessed or not? And then the protocol review, you mentioned that this is for RCTs. So do you accept all protocols for all RCTs that are submitted, or are you selective in deciding which to include and which to exclude? Thank you.
And over there, sorry, just rush to prepare your answer to those, Bill. And just there, yeah.
Hi, Ami Banerjee from Birmingham. Bill, thank you. I was interested in your comments about the research agenda and what the role of journals might be, because often policymakers talk about kind of investigator-driven research, and it's not as relevant to policy, and maybe it's even more relevant in the setting of global health. How do we get it right? Is there a role for involving policymakers, maybe even patients, more in setting that agenda, so that the end point isn't just to get a paper in the Lancet?
Thank you. And just on the end there.
Thank you for this. Helmut Roniger from London. You gave a very good overview over the research, how good we have become already, but I wonder about a fundamental problem in research. To use your picture, research nowadays is more and more rooted in commercial interest. We might be in danger that the fruits will be commercial success and not necessarily much gain. How can we correct for these things, that patentable therapies have got this huge research funding advantage to non-patentable psychiatric, psychotherapeutic or other interventions?
Thank you very much. Which do you want to start with, Bill?
Right, well, should we go in order?
Yep,
And
good.
Do you use plagiarism software?
We do, but I was interested to know that you say you do it as a routine for all your articles. Do you put them through? We do it on a suspicion, at the moment, on a basis of suspicion, because it's not the question of putting a piece of work through a plagiarism software program is easy enough, but it's the work involved in doing, then if you find something, how you act on that. But I don't know whether you do it on all of them.
At the moment, it's more for the non-research articles that we're using it. So how good is plagiarism software? I think a very good message to pass back to institutions is that it can detect a remarkable amount of likenesses to other material that is out on the web. So I think it's good enough to make people worried. Is it good enough for us to have confidence in it? I think we're still waiting for trials. At the moment, the software that we're using hasn't yet been openly released. What the software will do is obviously it will look for strings of words, and then it will tell the operator with a link to all the other articles where those same strings have been found. And the point of software isn't to penalize people whose first language isn't English. Working in Asia, I am sympathetic to the expression that I had trouble phrasing this better myself. But the point is helping people to rephrase words, and that unattributed duplication does not have a place in the scientific record. And this will take a change in attitude to evolve. But we do find plagiarism, and I think one of the biggest concerns is self-plagiarism. And this is very much a problem by established academics in top universities in Europe, in North America. And there has been a belief that if one had written the material oneself, then one could reuse it. We do not accept that. We don't feel that our readers want to read the same text repackaged by a prominent author in yet another review. So most university departments will regard that as a disciplinary matter. So I think that plagiarism is becoming very advanced, and I think that there is more plagiarism out there than any of us was prepared to comfortably admit. And I hope that both by detecting it and by deterring it, this sort of software will help. And as a spin-off, I hope that it will also assist in bringing along new generations of writers and reinforce the efforts that journals like the BMJ and the Lancet make to go out to authors and help them in writing research papers. Now, for protocol review, certainly for any randomized controlled trial that we receive as a submission, we ask for a copy of the protocol, and we will send that to the statistics and clinical reviewers. But the protocol review process is we'd love to have a protocol before the research has started, so that if it's a good question, we can use the peer review statisticians and peer review trialists to give you good ideas to actually make the protocol even stronger. And perhaps by getting a protocol that you can go back to your institution and say this protocol has been accepted. It may help you with getting funding. So I think it's a way of trying to give back a little bit, trying to play our role in improving the quality of research and encouraging good research questions.
Research agenda.
Research
Patients and
agenda.
policymakers.
Who sets the research agenda? Well, I think almost anyone in this room could be accused of that with a greater or lesser degree of support. I think the research agenda is changing. I suspect that we will see far less of a role, and in fact we have over the last year, being played by Big Pharma. The economic conditions are actually changing that. And as Muir spoke this morning, the era of effectiveness may be passing towards an era of efficiency and cost effectiveness. I think the problem is that if the agenda is set by people who are not clinicians, then there is always a risk that the patient is going to be left disenfranchised. And the questions that health systems are going to want answers for are going to be different than the questions that your patients want answers for. And this is why I think there is importance for dialogue. Unless journals hear from clinicians and actually publish intelligent pieces looking at important research questions, they're going to become less likely to be addressed.
What about patients, Bill? I mean, that was the question, wasn't it? I mean, why aren't patients setting the research agenda?
Well, patient funding bodies are. And
But the funding bodies isn't the patient.
Commissioning. Patient interest groups are setting the agenda, but with limited funds for doing so.
Or funds that come from the pharmaceutical industry.
Or funds that have been had a circuitous history. I think the biggest threat to the research agenda in the UK has been the move over the cost-cutting exercise that's going to see the devolution of fund holding. And that I worry we will see large companies with expertise in care management taking over commissioning from primary care trusts. And that suddenly we're going to see that the research priorities shift very much to health systems. And I think that that's going to really create a parallel literature. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I think that the research agenda is very distorted at the moment. I mean, that leads on to the second question, or third question rather, around the commercial interest and the fact that unpatented treatments are less likely to have good, thorough research done on them. And also, the research done on patented remedies is not good or thorough in a lot of cases because it's inaccurate and incomplete, and the data are not available, and the commercial interests are enormous. So I think we've got a real problem there. I think patient voices are not heard enough. The BMJ is as culpable in that as anyone. We as a journal, like The Lancet, we direct our output at doctors. But increasingly, certainly, I mean, I'm sure I'm not alone in this, I see the BMJ as a journal whose interests have to be the patient's interest and the public's interest, and that quite often, that will be divergent with doctors' interests. And I think that's a very tricky path to travel. So I think, how do we get the patients, and you mentioned policymakers, how do we get their involvement into the research agenda? I mean, I don't know, you may have an answer to your own question. How would you do that? How would you get patients and policymakers involved in research, setting the agenda?
I'm not. I definitely don't have the answer, but I'm a clinician and a researcher, and I guess I was talking as somebody in research institutions where often the aim of the research is to get published and not necessarily to get the research publication and the evidence utilised in healthcare. And so until those incentives change? I'm not sure how the agenda will change.
Am I right in saying that when you apply for research from some funders, you have to provide a dissemination plan? I think that is a very good positive step. I don't know, Bill, whether we're just becoming, perhaps a bit late in the day, aware of these dissemination plans and trying to support authors because they have to think ahead of time when they get their funding that, this is what we will do with the outputs. And I think journals could do more to help with whatever that may be. It may be that there are only 10 people in the world who need to read this piece of research to make the difference that it needs to make. It may be one of those bits of research like this, the work you published on Russia. It may be that only President Putin needs to read that piece of research. And we've already had George Bush reviewing the Lancet's work on deaths in Iraq. So, maybe only one person. But I think if the journals can help to make, do that work, then that may be one way forward. But I agree with you, the career kudos is linked to publication, not to influence in the real world.
I think just for dissemination strategies, I think one of the most important things is making sure as a researcher you're not tied into a contract that exhibits any control over your submission for publication.
Yeah.
And that so a clear dissemination strategy is incredibly important, particularly one that gives you, as the investigator, authority over how that dissemination takes place.
Yeah. Can I just let me ask? Sorry, hold on a second. I'm going to ask the gentleman at the back, and then I'll come to you.
Right. So, Tapas from Greece. I was thinking about N-of-1 trials, which might bring patients' agenda in focus, and remembering that N-of-1 trials are on the top of hierarchy, and your scope of trying to change the way of thinking. Isn't it striking that barely any N-of-1 trials are being published? And I keep in mind, Richard Smith's editorial some years ago, and Ian Chalmers' comments on the ethical maze one faces when trying to go through an ethics approval for an N-of-1 trial.
Okay, N-of-1 trials. Any more questions? Anyone who hasn't yet spoken? Here's a... Sorry, and then there's the lady at the back in the red, then that's the three and all.
Well, thank you very much. One of the points that I thought was really interesting that you were saying is about how you viewed incremental evidence as being less fit for general publication. And so my question was about general publication and who you view as your reader and how you view your readers as using the journal. Because I guess one of the things that, one of the impressions that I get when I'm reading through it is that just that a lot of the information is more specialized. And so I'm not sure that I necessarily see so many people reading through it the entire way.
Okay, thank you. And the lady in red at the back.
Hi, my name's Catherine Quarini from the BMJ Evidence Centre. I had a question about, you were saying that the work the Lancet publishes, you have to manage carefully how it gets into the popular media and how it's portrayed in newspapers and television, for example. Do you think journals have any role to play in doing the reverse procedure? So, for example, recently there have been lots of stories of high-profile celebrity deaths and illnesses celebrities have suffered from, which has then led to sort of mass panic of people, some rightly going for screening, but some being very worried and sort of hysteria about certain conditions. Do you think journals have any role in then commissioning work to actually find the evidence for these conditions and getting that out to the public?
Thank you very much. So, should we do N-of-1 first? Do you want to do that?
Yes. It's very interesting about N-of-1. We've published one N-of-1 trial in the last 5 years that I can think of, which was looking at a portable dialysis machine, a wearable dialysis apparatus. I think that what puts N-of-1 trials at the top of the pyramid for evidence managing individuals may actually put it lower down the pyramid for, by definition, for broad interest to readers. And you ask, who is that reader going to be? And I've got a very clear idea. I think of a middle-aged, little beyond middle-aged dermatologist who's having breakfast in Seattle. I don't know why, but I can imagine it is sort of as rainy as London. And I'm looking for the Hey Maud moment. Now, the Hey Maud moment in journalism is when you have this couple eating their breakfast in silence, and they've eaten their breakfast in silence together for years since the kids left home. And the dermatologist puts down his paper. He looks at his wife and he says, "Hey Maud, look at this." Something that is just so disruptive that it has to be shared, that it breaks down the conventions that had been part of that person's life. Now, yeah, that's an extreme example, but that's what we're looking for, is that article that really catches you, and we all know it. You're reading through a journal and suddenly you see something, you think, I have to share this with someone. This is really exciting. And so we're looking for that reader and to excite her or him wherever she or he may be, and do it in a way that changes the way that person thinks and will then lead on to something.
And then if the media is hyping something, what's the role of the journal?
Well, actually, I think we have a very good research community, because it usually doesn't take more than a few weeks after some celebrity event, then we will begin to receive research, often case control, looking at that event, looking at how that's influencing behavior. And many of those have been published in many journals. The typical example is after a TV suicide and looking at episodes of self-harm. And I think it was about 15, 20 years ago that a situation like that, with a published report afterwards, led to paracetamol packaging being reduced. Was that a BMJ paper?
I think it may have been,
yeah. So I think it's responsible to be involved in public health.
And the other thing that we certainly do on the BMJ, and maybe the Lancet does too, is we publish medicine in the media articles, which actually specifically, when an article gets hyped, I mean, it's a sort of attempt to put a more realistic shape on the story, and also to talk about how the hyping happened, and so that's another approach. Yes, sir, and then to this gentleman here.
You mentioned about contextualizing the evidence. I wonder, how do you do that for the developing countries context? Because a lot of evidence which is published, perhaps I know that your main audience is here, but you have a global impact as well. And I think that's lacking in most of the evidence you publish.
Thank you. And just down to here. Was that? I know you were commenting on something I said.
The question is to you.
Is it worth saying now, or do you want to hold it?
No, it's worth saying.
Okay, say it now.
It's going to change. It's going back to something you said.
Okay, if you just say, then we can.
Yes, I think you made the statement that your journal is making an effort to involve more the public and involve more patients, which is timely and important. However, I wonder whether you can use patients and public in the same breath. I'll give you a specific example. As a taxpayer, I want evidence-based medicine and I want cost-effectiveness. However, look at the wave of demand for having the operation for MS, for which there's no evidence. In Canada, for example, the federal government looked at the evidence and it's not prepared to fund any of the operations, not even researching the operation, because the evidence is scant or non-existent. However, the patient pressure was so great that one of the provinces, Saskatchewan, is going to pay to have this procedure evaluated. So, ultimately, the dirty little secret, as we heard this morning from Muir Gray, is that we all have self-interest. You know, the most obvious way is the drug industry, but the Lancet has journals of interest. And that goes back to my first question, which hasn't been answered yet, and that is, what's the relationship with the desire for novelty and the celebrity, the papers that some journals publish. And so I think if we're going to be realistic about solving the problem, let's recognize that we all, as the public, as patients, as professionals, as policymakers, we have conflicts of interest. And the sooner they're declared and dealt with, the further ahead we will be.
Well, I didn't want the panel session. My view is exactly that the journal system is pretty broken, and I think we've got a long way to go. I mean, it's hard for me to be a chair of the session. Okay, I was hoping there was another person here to balance this. I mean, I was going to say to Bill, I wondered if you feel that I'm sure that you've given a very moderated view here, but you give me the sense that you're saying that, I don't think you probably believe this, but you're given the sense that all is well in the world of journals, and I think that although journals probably do more good than harm, I think they also do a lot of harm. And I think we have a lot of conflicts of interest that we probably need to be very open about. So I mean, it's probably too late in the day to get into that, but Bill and I are on a panel later on this afternoon. You can come and listen to that conversation if you're interested in it. But the question prior to that was about developing countries, which I think is a very important one to answer to.
That question was suggesting that you felt we lacked context for developing country findings. Was that correct?
Yes.
I would actually strongly disagree with that. Published yesterday, you will see an entire series on malaria, and that much of our research has to do with developing countries. Earlier this last month, it was neglected tropical diseases. So we actually have what I think is perhaps an unfair reputation of not being interested in mainstream medicine for a preoccupation with developing countries. So they certainly receive a disproportionate amount of our space, and I think every effort is made to put them into context. For instance, if we look at Asia, we now have a website in China. We translate our press releases into local languages for different countries. I think we actually go quite a long way, particularly for developing countries, because actually we regard them as a priority and one of the places where we can try to do the greatest good. And I'd be happy to discuss celebrity papers over tea with you and why I think they're a good way of opening our horizons.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much. On that note, we should finish. I'm sure Bill will be happy to talk to anyone who wants to come up afterwards, and see you now. I think we break for do we break? Yes, half an hour break and then 3 o'clock. Thank you very much, everyone.